So we're doing the Great American Tycoons, and we believe that we should learn about this topic during the Progressive Era unit while we're reading The Jungle, because we never really learn about the employers, and these men who employed these big companies and big trusts owned a lot of the American economy and were a big influence on the economy today. So this indirectly affects us today and how we consume our goods, just like how it was during the Progressive Era. The dictionary.com defines a monopoly as an exclusive control of a commodity or service in a particular market, or a control that makes possible the manipulation of prices. And so this was a really big factor in the Progressive Era because certain men would own entire industries like steel, oil, whiskey, like food and beverages. And instead of 20 to 50 men owning these like now and creating a little bit more, the wealth gap getting a little smaller, only 2 to 4 men would own these industries, causing a huge, tremendous wealth gap. And the way that these men would do it to get to these high positions is they would cheat, scam, and perform morally unethical practices in order to dominate over their fellow Americans.
One of these men is Henry Ford. Henry Ford, as you may know, started the Ford Motor Company. Henry Ford became a mechanic, and that's how he started working on cars. And his first car was called the Quadricycle. And the Quadricycle, he built it and sold it between the ages of 16 and 20. And that's how he had money to start his first company. And the company that he formed originally was called the Detroit Automobile Company, later known as the Ford Motor Company. And he started that company in 1899. So what made Ford really innovative is that cars used to be a commodity for just rich people. And in 1905, Ford's backers were telling him, you need to make cars for the rich. And Ford said, no, I'm going to make cars for the common man. I'm going to make it so that my workers can use my cars as well. And because of that, he started inventing cars that were cheaper and easier to create. So in 1913, Ford created the first moving assembly line, which was crazy for the era. There's this similar assembly line we use today in today's manufacturing. And according to Times Magazine, Henry Ford's great strength was the manufacturing process, not the invention. What made Ford stand out is that he invented a way to create things. So after creating these cars that were cheaper and easier to build, he raised minimum wage, which set an industry-wide standard, and eventually a U.S. standard. So he doubled the minimum wage from $2.34 for 9 hours to $5 for 8 hours, which was amazing for the day. So Henry Ford was also a strong proponent of the 2-day weekend, which created a moment so that his workers could enjoy their automobiles. It set a cultural standard for the U.S. that we still follow today.
All right, John D. Rockefeller. Rockefeller created one of the largest companies known to mankind, also becoming one of the wealthiest men of all time. At one point, Rockefeller owned 90% of the oil industry, and in today's market, the oil industry is one of the largest, if not the largest. Countries will go over to war over oil. So Rockefeller started his Standard Oil Company in 1870, and eventually in the 1880s it became a monopoly and trust. So the way that he would do this is Rockefeller would buy cheap oil companies and make them more efficient, making his own oil barrels, finding his own oil and drilling it, creating his own byproducts from it, owning railroads through cartels, which pretty much was bullying other railroad companies into moving their stuff for a cheaper price. And so due to Rockefeller's enormous wealth gain, he created a lot of backlash from people, especially from muckruckers and politicians. So a muckraker is a journalist who goes after these big trusts and monopolies. So a very famous muckraker by the name of Ida Tarbell once said that Rockefeller and his associates did not build the Standard Oil Company in the boardrooms of the Wall Street banks. They fought their way to control by rebate and drawback, bribe and blackmail, espionage and price cutting, by the ruthless efficiency of organization. So Rockefeller built his empire by stepping on other men and by pretty much forcing others to join him, or by giving them all this business and going out. So Rockefeller's business eventually became so enormous that it was cut in 1890 by Ohio, and then it was cut again by antitrust laws in 1915 in New Jersey. This company was cut. It was cut to BP, ExxonMobil, Marathon, Chevron, and other various oil companies that we know of today and that we still use. So his company was huge and a huge part of the economy and what it is now. And another big part of Rockefeller, while he might have gotten his wealth dirty, was that he gave a lot in philanthropy. So one of the things he did was he donated a lot and created the University of Chicago and Rockefeller University, and he gave a lot to funds to fight ringworm and yellow fever, which we rarely ever see in the United States.
So another great American tycoon is J.P. Morgan. And as you may know, you recognize the name from J.P. Morgan Chase, which is today a huge bank. J.P. Morgan was a very important financer in this era, and he helped finance almost everything, from steel to electricity companies to railroads. He did it all. J.P. Morgan, when he was born, his family was already very wealthy. And at the age of 14, his father gave him $1 million, which today is a significant greater sum, and told him, invest it, make money out of this. And he did, and he was very successful at it. So J.P. Morgan continued to build his portfolio and his stock, and eventually became the most influential financer of the era. J.P. Morgan's influence can be seen in a great number of situations in the U.S. In 1895, Morgan helped rescue the American gold standard by loaning $60 million to the U.S. government, which helped stabilize the economy and helped the government stop the government from going into bankruptcy. J.P. Morgan also had a great number of influence in American culture because, according to jpmorgan.com, he helped finance Thomas Alva Edison's research into a practical electric light bulb, which is a light bulb that we use today. They're everywhere. J.P. Morgan helped finance the light bulb that became what we have today. J.P. Morgan also consolidated a huge amount of companies, and at one point he owned an estimated 1/6 of American railways, which was a huge amount of railways. And he's part of the reason that there began to be a movement against trusts, because he created a distrust in trusts and monopolies, because he started consolidating wealth and he started really working the market for his advantage. Lastly, J.P. Morgan's influence can be seen on the day he died. On April 14th, the day of his funeral, the New York Stock Exchange closed in his honor. Stock exchange closure is usually reserved for heads of states. J.P. Morgan is not a head of state. His influence was so great that they closed the stock market for him.
All right, Andrew Carnegie founded U.S. Steel and Carnegie Steel Company. He was an immigrant in 1859. When he was a bit older, he began to invest in iron and oil industries. And so these were huge industries, obviously, because they built America. And so the Carnegie Steel Company was an extremely dominant force, especially in the steel company. So he did this by maximizing profits and minimizing efficiencies through ownerships of the factories, where they would mine the ore, they would make the ore into steel, and then he also owned the railroads where it would be shipped out. So he owned everything in his industry. Carnegie eventually became an extremely wealthy man and created a trust by buying other companies and making them into his own. One time when he went back to his home, Scotland, and in 1892, his workers went on strike because their wages just got cut. And so because of this, the manager in the time called 300 Pinkertons in order to keep the peace. And so that day when they arrived, there was a brawl between the Pinkertons and the workers, and 10 men ended up dying. So Carnegie built up this image of rags to riches because he was an immigrant, came from nothing. And this whole look that he had was destroyed in one day, kind of exposing him to how brutal and how gross these trusts were. And so people went after him, and eventually he sold his company for $408 million back in 1901, which is a huge sum of money to J.P. Morgan, effectively making Carnegie one of the richest men of all time. And so when Carnegie went into retirement, he was one of the first private citizens to be philanthropic. And private philanthropy is a very big thing in the United States. It's not really practiced in Europe and other places around the world. It's kind of an American thing, and he kind of headed it. One of the essays he wrote was called The Gospel of Wealth. And in it he said that the man who dies thus rich dies disgraced. So he really pushed people who had large sums of money before they died to give away everything, and this is what he did. He almost died a broke man because of the amount of money he gave away. He gave hundreds of millions of dollars to libraries, organ transplants, medicine, education. He even created Carnegie Hall, which is one of the most lavish and world-renowned halls for music in the entire world. And today, I mean, we use steel to make skyscrapers, railroads. He built everything that we're on.
So what happened to these men? These men controlled huge swaths of the economy. They controlled most of the money. They controlled most of the jobs in the U.S. economy. So what happened to them? What happened to them is that people began to build a distrust in all these trusts and monopolies that they were building. And people started to hate them. People used to rebel against them. And the reason that they despise these companies is that they would price gouge, make everything cheaper, and then once they own the economy, they would skyrocket the price, and they would influence how much money you spent, where you spent it, how you would spend it, and people really began to distrust that. And within a decade of the first trust becoming a thing, with Rockefeller's oil trust, it led to the rise of the cotton trust, the lead trust, the sugar trust, the whiskey trust, along with telephone and tobacco. And all of them became trusts, monopolies, and very few people owned the industry. And in doing so, very few people controlled the economy. And this made a lot of people angry. In 1888, both the Democratic and Republican Party ran on antitrust platforms. For both parties to agree on one thing, with even today, is miraculous. And these parties created 3 antitrust laws. According to the FTC, the 3 antitrust laws are the Sherman Act, the FTC Act Ban, and the Clayton Act. What these 3 different laws do, the Sherman Act, which is the first act to be passed in 1890, was an anti-monopoly law, which really cracked down on how the monopolies were done, and it helped break up a Rockefeller's company in the 1890s. The second law was the FTC Act Ban, which outlawed unfair business practices such as price gouging and how you compete in the market. And the third act, the Clayton Act, barred the rest of the monopoly practices that the Sherman Act didn't cover. So these 3 laws together really stopped monopolies, stopped the trusts, and really led to a more open market and a bigger free market. And what also happened to these men is Teddy Roosevelt. In these pictures, you can see Teddy Roosevelt, which is a punter, killing the bad trust bear. And so Teddy Roosevelt, the trust buster, was forced politically into being antitrust, because originally Teddy Roosevelt was not super antitrust, and according to Ohio State, he only thought that the government should enforce a rule of reason, allowing these monopolies free range as long as they're within a certain boundary or set of rules. Political pressure forced him into being super antitrust, and that led to the destruction of these trusts and the destruction of these huge wealth gaps and these huge wealth consolidation.